Are you using a crop sensor camera and seeing pictures like this, but would really rather make pictures like this? I'm going to show you how to do it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey everyone, I'm Canon Explorer of Light, David Bergman. Look, I've been a music, sports, and portrait photographer now for nearly 30 years, but I'm here just for you every week to answer your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. I hope you're already a subscriber. If not, go ahead and click that little button down below. Also hit the bell so you'll get notifications of all the new free photo shows from myself and the other hosts on Adorama TV. Also go to AskDavidBergman.com. You can ask your own questions for the show. Also check out my availability for one-on-one workshops. I'll work with you directly over Zoom if you want it. All right, let's get to today's question. It is from Adalbert, and I'm probably pronouncing your name wrong. I apologize for that. But what he wants to know is, can Bokeh and APS-C sensor cameras be similar to that in full frame? If so, how? The answer is yes. All right, thanks, bye-bye. I'll see you back here next week. Now look, in all seriousness, this topic can actually get really complicated. And what I try to do on this show is take complex things and make them really practical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tech and why it works the way it does, but then I'm going to get into the practical things you can do to make great looking bokeh in your pictures. Now, yes, it is bokeh. That is how the Japanese actually pronounce it. It's a Japanese word that technically means blur or haze. Photographically, when we talk about bokeh, we're talking to the aesthetic quality of the blur in the background, and to a lesser extent, the foreground of your images. Now, photographers like to geek out about getting that pleasingly smooth bokeh in their images. The reason is because it's less distracting. The background, by being a nice, smooth, dark background back there, it makes your subject really pop off the frame. It's great for portraits and wildlife and even flowers, really anything where you want to isolate your subject. Now, there's a few things to do to get that smooth background. The most common way it's done is by decreasing your depth of field. Now, what we're talking about when we say depth of field is that plane of focus in your image that is what we say is acceptably sharp, right? So it's a bit subjective, but for the most part, when we focus on something, you're picking a plane of focus, and then how deep that focus goes where it's acceptably sharp is considered your depth of field. Now, all other factors being equal, a wider aperture will give you a shallower depth of field. So a big wide aperture, which is the lower numbers like 2.8 or f4 or even smaller numbers 1.2, 1.4, that is a wider aperture in your lens, and that's going to give you a shallower depth of field. Let's look at some pictures here. Now, I've got two pictures in here that I took with the same camera and the same lens. This was the Canon 1DX Mark III. I used a 7200 2.8 lens, and I shot them with different apertures. Now, I know this is a bit wonky. I've got some flowers taped to a tripod. I'm sorry about that, but this was the best way I could do it and really control the environment. So when I focus on the flowers here, this picture is at 2.8, and then this one is the same exact thing, but at f32, and that is a much smaller aperture opening, which is a wider depth of field. And you can see the focus is on the flowers, but the background in both images, I'm focused right on the flowers, but that background is extremely different, right? It's in the f32 image, there's much more depth of field. That background is really distracting, and you can't really see the flowers in the foreground. Now, the original question was about using APS-C cameras like the Canon M50, which I really like. It's a nice small camera that's easy to carry around. That thing has a smaller sensor, and when we talk about it, we call it a crop sensor camera. What happens is it's capturing less of the image circle that's projected onto that sensor. So with all things being equal, if it's the same lens, it's going to just capture a smaller portion because the sensor is physically smaller than on what we would consider to be a full frame sensor. So the Canon APS-C format is 1.6 times smaller than full frame, to be exact. Now, there are other formats. Nikon calls it DX. There's Micro Four Thirds and others, and they vary in that crop factor from 1.5 to 2 times crop. So, but the thing to know really about this question is that sensor size by itself has no impact on depth of field. It's simply just cropped in. The image is just cropped in, but that depth of field is not affected directly in any way. Now, what I did was I have the EF to M adapter, so I was able to put that same lens, that 7200 that I was using on the 1DX3, I was also able to put it on the M50. Let's look at some pictures here. These are using I'm at the same distance, the same shutter speed and aperture, right? So this one is with the full frame camera at 70 millimeters, and then this one is with the cropped M50, also at 70 millimeters. Now you can see those images look very different. Why is that? The focal length of the lens is exactly the same. Don't be confused by that. Focal length of a lens is actually a measurement, a physical measurement inside the lens. And when you put that lens on different bodies, whether it's a crop sensor body or not, the focal length does not actually change. It's still a 70 millimeter. But the field of view is different. Field of view and focal length are different things. The field of view is actually what we're seeing on the sensor, what is actually captured by the sensor. So a full frame sensor is going to capture a different field of view than a cropped sensor. So if we take these two images and we crop it in on the computer after the fact, you can see that we actually are getting pretty much the same image, because all we did was we took the same lens and shot it on two different bodies, one with a smaller sensor than the other. The depth of field is pretty much the same in both of these images. Now, there are other technical reasons why the two images don't look exactly the same. There's things like pixel density, and also, of course, the light has changed from image to image, so it looks a little bit different, but you get the general idea. The cropping itself does not change the depth of field. Now, to get the same field of view in camera without cropping after the fact like I just did here in the computer, you need to do one of two things. You either need to change the focal length, right, to change either zoom the lens in or use a longer focal length lens, or change your distance to the subject. Let's try both of those. Now, these next frames, these are with the at the same distance, but different focal lengths, right? So these two images, this one is with the crop sensor, and then this one is with the full frame. Now you can see the bokeh is different, right? All I changed here was the focal length. I zoomed in on that full frame camera to about 112 millimeters, which is 1.6 times 70 millimeters, right? Now, it's going to create a shallower depth of field because I'm zoomed in a lot more, but the field of view of the image is exactly the same, right? Now we can try something else and actually change our distance. These next two images are shot at the same exact focal length, but I physically moved myself closer and further away. Both were taken at 70 millimeters. With the M50, I was further away to match that field of view on the full frame camera. Now again, the bokeh is different in these two images. The full frame is more out of focus because I'm closer to the subject and then further away from the background. So it's gonna make that background more out of focus. Now, to get the same field of view, you have to change one of those things, right? You have to change the lens focal length or your distance to the subject or in the background, right? So now both of those scenarios that we just demonstrated here will change the look of the bokeh. It's not as smooth on the crop sensor. That's why people generally like to say that crop sensor cameras don't have as nice a bokeh as full frame. But technically, it's not the sensor size that's causing that. It's the other things that you have to change in order to compensate for the adjusted field of view on the crop body. You have to change your distance or your focal length. So I don't want to get any deeper into the math and talk about entrance pupils or pixel density or anything like that. Let's get practical. I'm going to give you 5 tips for getting the best bokeh on crop sensor cameras because it is certainly doable. Number 1, shoot with the widest aperture you have. Lenses that are made for crop sensor bodies are less expensive, they're smaller, but usually they don't make them at really wide apertures. You can't open that aperture as wide as you can generally on full frame cameras. The kit lens that came with this M50 is a 15 to 45, which is a variable aperture 4.5 to 6.3. So that means zoomed in all the way at 45 millimeters, it's a 6.3. Let's see what that looks like, right? So this is at 45 millimeters is 6.3. It's kind of a nice all-purpose lens, but it's really not great for creating a very shallow depth of field. I recommend getting an adapter like that EF to M adapter that I was using, so you can put those EF full frame lenses on that crop sensor body. You could put something like the 85 1.4 on that body and get a really great looking image when you can shoot at 85 millimeters at 1.4. All right, next, number 2, use the longest focal length possible. When we talk about a portrait lens, a lot of times we're talking about an 85 millimeter or more. There are fewer APS-C options for long telephoto lenses, like more than 50 millimeters, also with wide aperture. So using lenses made for full frame with an adapter will help a lot. 200 millimeters at 2.8 looks amazing on a full frame or a crop sensor body like this image right here. So if you can get that long lens for that crop sensor body, you're going to be golden. Number 3, get close to your subject and far from your background. Take a look at these 2 images now. If we are far away from both the subject and the background, there's really no separation, right? The flowers just blend in with that background. Everything else being the same, but moving the flowers away from the background and getting the camera close like this will make that background go much more out of focus. All I did was pull it way across the backyard there and get right up close to those flowers, and you can see that background is a lot less distracting and way more out of focus than it was in the first image. Number 4, use a dark background. Take a look at this. This technically doesn't change your depth of field at all, but the thing is your eye goes to the brightest part of an image first. If you have a dark, out of focus background, it's less distracting. So if you can shoot backlit, for example, especially if you can be up against trees or bushes or something dark and solid, you're gonna be much better off. Again, this does not technically affect the depth of field, but it does change the look of that out of focus area if you can get it dark with your image really bright, with your subject really bright in the foreground. This works great for faces. All right, number 5, use high quality lenses. This really helps to a lesser extent, but the well-made lenses really have better things like better coatings on them, and they have more aperture blades for rounder shape of specular highlights in the background if you have those little bright points of light. I've done videos about changing the shape of the bokeh in your background. I'll put a link down below so you can check those out if you want. So here's the thing with those 5 tips, the more of those 5 things that you can apply, the better your bokeh is gonna look. Whether you're shooting flowers, animals, or people, using only that M50, which has an APS-C crop sensor camera, crop sensor in it, you can go from this, to this, to this, and even all the way to this. Those are all with that crop sensor body, just like you asked. So, Adalbert, I hope that helps you out. I hope that helps a lot of people. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them down below. I'll answer them as best as I can, as often as I can. Also, remember, AskDavidBergman.com. Don't forget to go there. You can submit your own photo questions. Check out my one-on-one Zooms. I can help you out directly. If you have any specific questions that I can help you out with, make sure you subscribe to Adorama TV, and don't forget to come back here every 10 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. every Monday. I'll be back here with a new episode of Ask David Bergman.